Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not on campus today, but I still wanted to go through and do a full review. So, what will follow is a full pre recorded review lesson that is going to be done. And then afterwards, or not afterwards, while we're going through it, go ahead and make sure that you are filling out the review guide. All that stuff will be on Google Classroom. The instructions will be on Teams. And if you have any questions, reach out to me on Teams. So first things first, this is period 3. So 1754, pre-revolution, age of protest, all the way into 1800, early republic, new constitution, all that good stuff. So we're going to go ahead and get into that. But before we do, I want to go over the review guide a bit because I changed it up a little since I'm not going to be there and since this is pre-recorded. So what the review guide basically is, the beginning's a little more like the older ones, but as it goes on, and by the end for sure, by the middle and end, the meat of it, the majority of it, is just fill in the blank. Fill in a few blanks, define a few terms, things like that. Some of them are just written in there, and it's just for you to go along. It's just so you have these as solid review notes for period 3. Tomorrow it'll be, especially with the topics that we're covering, which is all that pre-sectionalism and all that stuff, you'll get the charts, you'll get the images, the review guide will look more like the older ones. But today specifically, it's a lot of information and not a lot of spreading out that it's going to be more fill in the blank. So you'll watch the video of me going through the slides, fill in the blanks as you go along, pause it if you need to along the way. And again, if there's anything unclear, or if you're not getting something either in the review guide or on the slides, message me on Teams. I'm not on campus, but I should still be able to respond on Teams. And of course, like you should be knowing already, like you should be doing, right? Don't forget to upload your notes into the review guide post on Google Classroom. That's your exit ticket. So I prefer you upload the full notes, the digital version, but you can do a paper version with a picture, or you can just do the notes from your notebook. But make sure you're uploading your notes. So with that being said, let's get right into the review. All right. So, what are we starting with? We are starting with the French and Indian Wars, or the 7 Years' War. Both names. Write down both names. Write down both names. And the reason that conflict starts in North America, now this is a global conflict. There's going to be fighting all over the world. Fighting starts in North America because of disputes over the Ohio River Valley. Who owns it? Right? If you ask the British what's going on, the British are going to say, well, the French are kind of getting near our territory. And you ask the French what's going on, the French are going to say, well, the British are kind of getting near our territory. They both think they own that territory. They're not sure who it does. Early in the war, the British are losing. They lose lots of battles. It's really embarrassing for one of the strongest countries in the world. But what ends up happening as a result, and during the initial losses, you get a Congress that meets in the colonies. And Ben Franklin has this plan, the Albany Plan. It was created. The whole thing was unite the colonies, join or die. Let's get together. Let's fight the French. The plan is rejected because of the taxes involved. But the system, the idea of, hey, we have a problem, all the colonies need to get together and talk about it, join or die, all that stuff, is the mold for future revolutionary congresses. So that's what you need to point out. Albany Plan, mold for future revolutionary congresses. And the British will eventually win the war. The Peace of Paris, or Treaty of Paris, this might be a good way, right? Peace of Paris, Treaty of Paris, 1763. Has major ramifications, and we're going to get into those on the next slide. Alright, so, effects of the war. A couple of things, major things. The French are effectively removed from North America. In order to keep their expensive sugar plantations, this is kind of what we talked about last time, how sugar plantations are worth a lot of money. The French give up pretty much all of their North American territory. Canada, the Louisiana territory goes to Spain. It's the British double their land holdings, essentially. They get a huge chunk of land to the west. But with that doubled land holding comes trouble, because now the British still have to deal with natives. And again, they just finished fighting a really expensive war. Wars are expensive. And in order, what's going to happen immediately also is the British are going to declare the Proclamation Line of 1763 right along the border of the colonies and the new territory, preventing, at least on paper, in the rules, British colonists from settling in Native Americans' land, areas where Native Americans are living. Native Americans are living there. The British don't want to deal with them. Hey, you keep that land. It's ours, but you can live there. Settlers, stay where you already are. Don't go west. This really angers the colonists, right? Because for one, a colonist's favorite thing is to expand west. And for two, or for another reason, the colonists felt like they were owed that land. They fought in the war. They fought, bled, died, struggled. With the promise that they were going to get that territory, right? That Ohio River Valley territory, all that good land. And they weren't being allowed that territory. On top of all this, war debt. Again, wars are expensive. I said it before, I'm going to say it again. And with this debt came taxes. The British answer are taxes. So let's go ahead and move on. And again, I didn't say it at the top, but I'm going to be moving through the slides quickly. I'm going to explain them and I'm going to move on. If you need time on it, just pause. Pause as you go because this is all pre-recorded. Alright, so taxation without representation. This idea, this concept, right? Generally, the reason that it comes up, and it's not a bad thing, idea logically at least, the British are like, hey, we fought that war to protect you, and now we don't have any money, so, pay for it? And the colonists are like, no, I don't want to do that. And so what you get are the British having to tax the colonies in all sorts of different ways. And even though the colonists are loyal to the British government, they've operated on their own independence level for so long that rules and taxes and laws that are really strict bother them. It's shocking. It's something they would never expect. It would be kind of like... I guess the best way to describe it would be like if for every exam I gave you all the answers to the exam while you were taking it in the Zoom call. And then on the semester exam, I didn't give you the answers. I just made you take the exam on yourself. You'd be shocked. It'd be like crazy. No, I'm not going to give you the answers on the test, by the way. And that system where the British kind of let the colonies do their own thing, right? Because the colonies did their own thing. They smuggled. They didn't follow the rules. They didn't pay for their taxes all that much. Was called salutary neglect. The British ignoring the colonies and letting them do what they want because prior to the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, it was making everybody money. And on top of this, the Quartering Act of 1765, which requires troops to remain in North America to enforce new laws, was put into place. Those troops also had to be housed by the colonists when their housing was not adequate. So let's go ahead and move forward with that. Again, pause these if you need time in between. More taxation. So, of course, the dreaded Sugar Act came into play. Taxes on luxury items like sugar, wine, coffee, and molasses. Things that were not easy to acquire, essentially. Things that were really comfy and nice to have. I don't know, maybe today it would be things like... what would be a luxury item? Maybe like internet, or really fast internet costs you like not just a little more, but a lot more. Could be internet. Internet might be a decent one. Luxury items. I don't know. Fancy clothes, maybe. The Stamp Act of 1765 was a tax on all paper goods, playing cards, books, and anything you can think of that has to do with paper. Newspapers, writing paper, anything. Notebooks, anything. And colonists will start to argue that it is illegal to tax them if they are not represented in Parliament. Parliament's counter is that colonists, you are represented through something called virtual representation. And the idea of virtual representation is that since Parliament had all classes of the British government or people represented, poor, rich, everything in between, colonists were represented virtually. All locations do not have to be there because all of the classes of people were there. At least that was the idea. In response to things like the Tax Act, groups like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty will rise up to combat, protest, and boycott. Include boycott, even though it's not written in there. The Stamp Act. So let's move forward. More taxation and representation on the next slide. Eventually, the Stamp Act Congress creates a special petition to repeal the Stamp Act. The term taxation without representation comes from this Congress. Now, this is really important. The Stamp Act Congress felt that this was a tyranny that needed to be addressed. But they were still loyal to Britain. They were not thinking about independence yet. They were loyal. They thought that they were owed better as loyal British subjects. In response to this, Parliament will repeal the Stamp and the Sugar Acts. But next year they will pass something called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act basically is Britain saying, hey, we took away those taxes, but we can tax you whenever we want, because you're our colony. So we can tax you. We're not going to, but we could if we wanted to. That's the Declaratory Act. So on the books, it now says, hey, the Parliament can tax the colonies whenever they want. And then, a little bit after, you get the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts are taxes on tea and other items, all sorts of items, I believe glass, oils, all sorts of things. And many of the colonies ended up boycotting these items. They would spin their own cloth for clothes. They would brew their own herbal teas at home. And this was mainly done by women, groups like the Daughters of Liberty. Herbal teas especially, that was a big thing. I think they called them Liberty Brews. Kind of like, like the Freedom Fries thing. It's kind of silly. But it was a way to tell the British government, hey, we're not happy. Right? Okay, so let's move forward and talk about the actual protest now. So, in 1770, you get the Boston Massacre, right? A group of whippersnappers, angry colonists, I don't know what you would call them. There was a bit of a kerfuffle with the British soldiers guarding a tax house that led to violence. Nobody really knows why or who or what reason for the first shot happened, but a shot was fired and multiple shots followed out, kind of scattered. It's important to note that of the soldiers that went to trial, I believe 6 of 8 were found to have done no wrongdoing because, again, despite what Patriot propaganda will have you believe, the Boston Massacre is very much a fight and a violent group of people that started with snowballs but very much escalated throwing rocks and sticks and shells and clubs and all sorts of things at these soldiers. And let's keep that in mind, right? This is a piece of propaganda, though, that will really fuel the Patriot movement. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, the Paul Revere etching, silver etching, which is that image right there, will take hold in the colonies. And it'll portray the British as cruel and evil. Then you get the Boston Tea Party protest against the Tea Act, which remains there, right? Tea Act bad. They dump millions of dollars worth of tea, millions in today's money, over the ship and into the harbor as a protest because basically the big thing the Tea Act does that bothers everybody is it makes British East India Company tea the company that has to be purchased. The tea that has to be purchased, I'm sorry. It's the only company that can sell tea in the colonies. But the colonists were really fond of smuggled in Dutch tea because it was cheaper. And I believe, don't quote me on this, don't really necessarily write this, but to my understanding, they just liked it more. Like it was, I don't know. But they liked it a little more, but on top of that, they liked that it was cheaper. That's probably the biggest reason. So they're not happy that now they can't do that. And again, before smugglers weren't caught and punished. Now smugglers get caught and punished, and the British are actively trying to prevent smuggling. Because that's how you turn neglect thing, right? Going away. So now the smuggled tea is not getting to them. So the Boston Tea Party happens. And in response to the Boston Tea Party, this time the British get a little upset. And they pass something called the Coercive Acts, all right? This was a punishment for the Boston Tea Party. The Coercive Acts were a punishment for the Boston Tea Party. The colonists, by the way, will call these the Intolerable Acts. Write down both names. You need both names. The acts included closing the Boston harbor until the colonists paid for the tea, which they never did. It introduces a new guidelines to the Quartering Act, so more quartering of soldiers. It shut down the local governments in Massachusetts, and it made British officials that were going to be on trial, it allowed them to go back to England to serve trial instead of using American courts. The coercive/intolerable acts specifically lead to more organization in the colonies, because the other colonies start realizing if the British can do it to one, then the British can do it to all of them. So if the British can do it to one, the British can do it to all of them. That makes the colonies unite a little more and get a little closer. Which leads us to their first big meeting, again, based on that Albany Plan idea, the Continental Congress, which was in 1774. Again, in 1774, these are still loyal British subjects. And they don't want independence, but they want to petition the government for their natural rights as Englishmen. Again, the Enlightenment comes into play here. All of these guys are big Enlightenment fans. They're all in the I Heart the Enlightenment fan club. And they're all wearing the t-shirts. They're all good to go. The ideas of natural rights, the social contract, and separation of powers all greatly influence these people. These were already in your other review when we talked about the Enlightenment, so I'm not going to define them in this clip. But if you don't have them, go back to the other slides or go back to the older videos on YouTube and find them, because they're really, 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 really important. So moving forward a little bit, initially olive branch petition, all that good stuff. Hey, we don't want to be independent. But by 1776, the Congress has met again and again, and shots have already been fired at Lexington. And by 1776, it's been decided by the elites, the people that are there at the Congress, that the right course of action is independence. But most colonists, like most of the regular people, pretty much almost all of them, did not see it that way. Most of the regular people did not see the benefit in going independent. Until Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, which was really well worded, really well written, and which convinced most people that independence was the right course of action. So that's what happened. Common Sense, Thomas Paine, convinced regular people that independence was the way to go. So let's get into the thing that was declared at the Constitutional Convention. At the Continental Congress, sorry. So, Declaration of Independence, written in 1776 by Thomas Jefferson. And basically it just declares independence. We are our own independent nation. That's it. That's all it does. I've declared independence. It doesn't do anything. I declared it. It doesn't matter, right? But independence is declared. Now the war has to be fought. But now the colonies have identified themselves as an independent nation, which is something they hadn't done before. Just note, somewhere to put, in case you forgot, in case you're not sure, in case we only talked about it once. Not all of the colonists in the colonies are for independence. A good number of them remain loyal to the crown, and they are, of course, known as loyalists. So one slide for the war, really brief. Washington is given command of the Continental Army, which is created by Congress. Continental Army is undermanned, undersupplied, undertrained. Not a great army, at least at the start. But they have a lot of resolve. You know, they got a lot of what would you say, like I don't know. They got like vinegar in them. They're ready to go. Man, that's an old guy reference. I don't think y'all will get that. I'll explain it tomorrow. Ask me about the vinegar reference if you're not sure what I mean by that. But the main battles that you got to know, we talked about more in class. And if you want to know a little bit more background info on battles, please review that older stuff, but we're not going to talk about it for review, right? We got Lexington and Concord, shot heard around the world, first battle. Then we're going to skip all the way to Saratoga, which is the turning point of the war when France joined the fight after they saw that the Americans could win. Then you have the winter at Valley Forge that same year in 77. The winner proves that Washington is capable of being a good leader, and it helps train the army. The army gets better after that winter as opposed to keep continually getting worse. And then Yorktown, 1781 is the final battle. The British forces surrender. And then after the Treaty of Paris of 1783, the war's over and we're a new nation. So, the new government was formed under something called the Articles of Confederation. That was the original constitution and law of the land. It was a legislative body that held pretty much all the power under the AOC government. And the AOC did not have an executive branch or a judicial branch. They could not levy taxes, this is important, and they couldn't raise an army. The only positive was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It abolished slavery in the Northwest Territory, and it allowed for this territory, it gave them rules for how to become a state. In this era period, you get something known as Shays' Rebellion happen. Shays' Rebellion is an armed revolt done by out-of-work farmers who owed a lot of debt that was put down by the local militia. What Shays' Rebellion does is it highlights the weaknesses of the AOC. And it leads to constitutional conventions, or a constitutional convention, where a meeting is going to happen where we have to all figure out how to fix the Constitution. So, Constitutional Convention of 1787. Originally, it's there to fix the AOC. That's what they're there for. However, as people debated and discussed, clearly the goal became creating a new constitution. And two factions formed. Federalists wanted to strengthen the federal government. And then anti-federalists who wanted to keep the power with the states and keep the federal government weak. The issues that were contested came from representation. That's the biggest challenge there. How do we count, and how do we count like regular people according to them? Again, according to them, that's a horrible way to say it. And then how would enslaved people count towards population? How do we count the population, and how do we count the enslaved people in the population? Representation. So, first thing you have is the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise is what solves the problem of representation. Large states supported a plan called the Virginia Plan, which is based on population. More people in your state, the more representatives you get. Smaller states supported the New Jersey Plan, which is based on equality. Each state gets the same number of votes. What does the Great Compromise do? It makes a bicameral legislature that uses both, right? One, the House of Representatives, is population-based, and the Senate is equality-based. For the slavery issue, the major factor of slavery was basically broke down like this. Southerners wanted slaves to count towards their representation. Northerners did not. And the 3/5 compromise said, well, tally up your slave population, 3/5, count towards your population. Even though none of these slaves actually got to vote, obviously. These slaves did not get the right to vote. This was all just giving the slave owners or the people that were not slaves in that state more votes. Let's move forward. So we have a new constitution made. This new constitution had a more robust federal government. It was stronger, but it was still split into 3 branches, separated. Legislative, executive, and the judicial, right? Remember the Federalist Papers, which were written by Federalist leaders like Hamilton, John Jay, and Madison, that were all in an attempt to support and convince people to ratify the Constitution, because people still have to vote for this, regular people, on the state level. The Federalists get the Constitution ratified, but in part because they agreed to include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution to guarantee and protect individual rights. Now that we got a Constitution, now that we've got a new government, we got to develop a culture, right? And what you get is national leaders calling for education and reforms in art and paintings like Hudson River School, things like that. And this concept of Republican motherhood starts coming up. The idea that a woman's role in government is to raise sons with the virtuous principles of liberty. Whatever silliness that means, right? But the idea is like, hey, you want to help, make sure your son understands liberty and government and politics and all that stuff. So that's the idea behind Republican motherhood. So, let's bring us to our first president, right? Of course, you all know Washington gets his presidency, and it is unanimous. Everybody wants him, and he agrees to do it. He set up all sorts of precedents during his presidency. He was not pregnant. These precedents included things like a cabinet, a vice president, the term limit, as well as little stuff like the term Mr. President, or wearing civilian clothing instead of his military uniform. Secretary of War, State, Treasury, and Justice were the cabinet members that he appointed, and he had all sorts, right? And you can't talk about Washington's administration without talking about Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury and his financial plan. The federal government assumes state debt. You guys probably know this already, right? Which unites the states together and gives the government, the national federal government, more credit with other countries. Hamilton created a national bank using the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution, right? He had an elastic interpretation of the Constitution versus strict. And really quick, what does that mean? Well, if you're a strict interpretationalist, if you're a strict constructionalist, right, of the Constitution, basically you think what's written in there is what you do, and that is that. Strict interpretation means if the Constitution doesn't say you can do it, then you can't do it. Whereas elastic or loose interpretation means the Constitution has to say you can't do it, otherwise you can probably try to do it. Right? So even though the Constitution doesn't explicitly give Hamilton the right or the power to make a national bank, it doesn't tell him he can't make one. And because of that, he will wiggle his way in there and make one. More about Washington. He dealt with the Whiskey Rebellion. Part of Hamilton's plan came a tax and excise tax on whiskey, and this upset poor farmers, so again they rebelled. The rebellion's crushed by not the military, but by a militia that was federalized. Partially led by Washington, by the way, is the only sitting president to lead troops in battle. This revolution was a response to an excise tax placed on whiskey. I already said that. I don't know why I'm repeating myself. But after 2 4-year terms, which is, again, one of his major precedents, Washington steps down and gives his farewell address, which had 2 main warnings. First, avoid political parties and their use. He thought they could hurt the country. Second, avoid foreign alliances and foreign wars. He thought that would make things bad for the U.S. as well. Which brings us to our next guy, John Adams. He was president during the XYZ affair, and he was not as well loved as Washington. Not at all. He only served 1 term, and he also passed something called the Alien and Sedition Acts through Congress. Or his government did. The XYZ affair is an incident where French diplomats refused to talk to American delegates without receiving a bribe. So they demanded a bribe from the Americans. When the people heard about it, they were referred to as XYZ, hence the name. A big insult to America. Everybody wanted to go to war, but he was like, no. The one positive thing, the biggest positive thing, and you might want to write this in, that Adams did, is he keeps the United States out of a war with France, because it was really close. The Alien and Sedition Act's not great. Alien Act makes it easy to deport immigrants, and the Sedition Acts made it illegal to speak badly about the government in public. In response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, Kentucky and Virginia will pass the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which state that any law passed by the federal government that is so unconstitutional, like the Alien and Sedition Acts, could be nullified by the states. This can come back to haunt everybody, kick everybody in the butt later in something called the Civil War. So, the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act was established as a way to regulate westward expansion and dealings with natives. Problem was, it's ignored by settlers because that's, again, settlers' favorite thing to do is expand west. So, conflicts with natives continued. Britain kind of supports the natives on the side, by the way. Just keep that in mind. You'll need that for later. And the southern frontier with border also had some struggles. Where does Georgia end? Where does Florida start? So the Pinckney Treaty is signed to establish a border between the United States and Spain. The United States and Spain. And lastly, a horrible legacy of slavery. Know that by this point in some northern states there is a rapid population growth of freed blacks. In some states like New Jersey, and I believe it's only New Jersey, but I say some, they let them vote. Free blacks were able to vote. In the South, the black population was mostly enslaved, and that population was growing. Something to keep in mind. Slaves are growing. New legislation made it almost impossible to free your slaves, and slavery is spreading out west as expansion west expands. So as more westward expansion happens, these landowners are taking slavery and spreading out west with them. So that is it, guys, for this video. It is pre-recorded. I know it's not the best circumstances, but I had to be out today. So this is a full review. Again. Do not hesitate to send me a message on Teams if you need something explained a little better, or if I rush through something, or if there's something wrong with this video and you can't hear it, or if the guide is unclear. Let me know and I'll help you guys out, because this is a really important time, and I'll be back tomorrow and we'll go through live and we'll talk a little bit about this really quickly, and then we're going to get into period 4. So have a great rest of your day, guys. I'll see you all tomorrow.